Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of your course. And the title of our lecture today is Changing the Master Narrative and German Accounts of Victimization. In previous lectures, we discussed the rubble years, 1945 to 49, and the reasons for the diminished efforts of Allied denazification, along with the Nuremberg trials and legal evidence for the Holocaust. We also discussed Konrad Adenauer's tenure as German Chancellor. In this lecture, we will discuss how master narratives of German responsibility for World War II and the Holocaust changed under Willy Brandt in the 1960s and 70s, along with some of the more notable trials, such as the Frankfurt Auschwitz and Adolf Eichmann trials, which contributed to waves of changing perceptions of the war and of collective responsibility. In brief review, the immediate post-war era saw the U.S. Office of Military Government, United States, or OMGUS in Germany, under the command of General Lucius Clay, conducting surveys of Germans' views of the recent past. According to the survey results, a substantial majority admitted that the German population as a whole should bear some blame or guilt for Nazi crimes. However, 83% of Germans surveyed believed Germany's crimes were only on the same level as other nations. So right away, there was a problematic dichotomy in German perceptions of the war. Lily Gardner Feldman, a scholar and fellow at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, suggests Germans were deeply divided on the interpretation of the responsibility for crimes committed. While there was evidence for guilt, there was also evidence for continued anti-Semitism and denials of responsibility. During this time, Germans also had fresh memories of their own victimization, including Allied bombings, the evacuation of 15 million ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, and the brutal treatment from the Red Army as it approached from the east, including murder, rape, and robbery. Were their claims of victimization legitimate, especially considering the evidence for the complicity of ordinary Germans in Nazi crimes? Let's briefly consider the evidence for collective responsibility. The November 1938 anti-Jewish events known as Kristallnacht caused the destruction of synagogues and the vandalization and looting of Jewish businesses and homes. Ordinary Germans were witnesses, and in many cases were co-perpetrators. The ensuing Aryanization directly benefited German citizens as they took Jewish businesses and property for their own. Many Germans openly embraced the war and the mistreatment of Jews. Austrians welcomed the Anschluss and unification with Nazi Germany. At least some percentage of Germans would have lived in close proximity to concentration camps. Women would have been in contact with their Wehrmacht family members, knowing at least some of what was happening. And they contributed to the labor force during the war as well. So ordinary Germans knew what was happening, or at least they had a good idea of what was happening. The apologetic discourses of not knowing or having no power to do anything about it couldn't stand in the light of the evidence of their complicity. In the Adenauer era, the narrative on responsibility was vague. His statement, "Unspeakable crimes have been committed in the name of the German people, calling for moral and material indemnity," was seemingly a clear statement of German responsibility, but the language is actually nonspecific. Crimes were committed in the name of German people? Then who committed those crimes? Was it the Germans? Despite efforts to pay reparations to Israel, which was heavily influenced by the United States, the dominant narrative had not really changed to the point where Germans were accepting of this idea of collective responsibility. So what were the events that transpired in the 60s that changed the overarching German narrative? In relation, what were the political, social, and international factors that influenced collective memory? Finally, if Germany was beginning to come to terms with the past, then how was the victim narrative changing? The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Israel in 1961 was a public event that followed his public capture in Argentina. Eichmann was one of the main authors of the final solution, and many thought he should be tried in Germany or in an international court. An estimated 500 journalists from around the world came to cover the event. This had the effect of showing the world, including Germans, what had happened during the Holocaust. The judge and prosecutor were both German Jews, and much of the trial was in German. The trial was also televised, so many Germans were able to see the trial and the guilty verdict of Eichmann. This trial had incredible social and international ramifications for memory of the Holocaust and the question of blame, not just in Germany, but beyond. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials were also happening in Germany in the 60s, from 63 to 66, where many concentration camp guards or SS officers were tried according to German criminal law, which was amended so that Nazi crimes were not subject to the statute of limitations. This was an interesting effect here, as statute of limitations was 20 years, and this is the mid-60s, so they would have passed their time of being able to prosecute these crimes. So this had the effect, the internal effect, showing Germans that Nazi crimes were never out of reach of prosecution, and that even seemingly ordinary citizens 20 years later could bear the consequences of their actions from the Holocaust. A significant factor in changing the narrative was Willy Brandt himself, who was the leader of the Social Democratic Party in Germany and the chancellor from 1969 to 1974. He resisted the Nazi regime and ideology from the beginning and fled to Norway, later Sweden, in World War II. As chancellor, he knelt and laid a wreath at the memorial of the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw in 1970, and he signed the Treaty of Warsaw, which committed Germany and Poland to nonviolence and kept the existing border imposed by the Allies at the Potsdam Conference. Up to this point, German leaders had avoided the concept of collective guilt and emphasized that Germans were atoning for the crimes committed by the Third Reich, not by Germany or average Germans. Brandt, however, was the first German head of state to draw a line, saying no German is free of history. Here was a leader who had no part in Nazi crimes and in fact resisted, who made bold gestures to show collective German responsibility. These events had a profound impact on shifting the narrative to one of acknowledged responsibility. The victim narratives had gone into remission with such a public spotlight on the crimes of the Holocaust and the German Chancellor's willingness to accurately acknowledge the past. However, memory is constantly changing and shifting, and victim narratives would return in later decades. Some of these narratives present a conflict, as you'll see in the next module, because some Germans have legitimate claims as victims. With that being said, I want you to think about the following question. If the claims of Germans' victimization are juxtaposed with the atrocities of the Holocaust, do the victim narratives in Germany have equal weight with the Holocaust? Furthermore, in the last module, you learned about the concepts of victor's justice and the So You Too defenses at Nuremberg. Do these represent valid arguments when considering the gravitas of the Holocaust? As historian Robert Moeller suggests, we must write a history of the war's end in which some Germans were victims, some Germans were perpetrators, and some Germans were both. However, Michael Geyer and Michael Latham suggest that the German people need a national narrative and memory of World War II that accurately reflects the atrocities and the annihilation that they themselves caused. Gilad Margalit, an Israeli historian, agrees and suggests that though many Germans were legitimate victims, this does not take away from their collective responsibility for the crimes committed during the Holocaust. So as you write your essay this week, I want you to think about these complex issues and how they interrelate. Thank you.